Julian Thorne had built a financial empire few could even dream of. At 52, he controlled one of the nation's largest investment firms. His transactions, involving billions of dollars, shaped the destinies of entire corporations. His day began religiously at 5 a.m. He opened the international markets, analyzing fluctuations from across the globe while he slept. He possessed an almost supernatural ability to process complex financial information, making multi-million-dollar decisions in minutes. His colleagues respected and feared him in equal measure, knowing Julian possessed not only exceptional technical knowledge, but an uncanny intuition about market movements, putting him several steps ahead of the competition. The sprawling estate where he lived with Eleanor perfectly mirrored his decades of obsessive work. 8 spacious bedrooms, 5 luxuriously appointed bathrooms, an Olympic-sized swimming pool rarely used, 2 acres of gardens designed by internationally renowned landscape architects. The underground garage housed a collection of European sports cars, more status symbols than genuine passions. Julian rarely found time to appreciate them, except when impressing important clients. Every detail was meticulously planned, an extension of his office, a place where business meetings could take place in environments showcasing success and sophistication. The private conference room, comfortably seated 12, equipped with state-of-the-art video conferencing technology, facilitating simultaneous negotiations with investors on different continents. But behind this carefully constructed opulence, Julian carried an emotional weight no amount of money could alleviate. 3 years and 4 months ago, his wife, Eleanor, suffered a devastating stroke, changing not only their individual lives, but the entire dynamic of everything they had built together. Over nearly 3 decades of marriage, Eleanor wasn't, as many might assume, simply a decorative wife who married a rich man for financial security. She was intelligent, educated, and ambitious, holding an MBA in finance from one of the nation's top universities. During the first 15 years of Julian's company, she was far more than a personal companion. She was a true business partner, responsible for structuring the internal processes and control systems that fueled the company's exponential growth during its most critical expansion phase. Together, they spent countless nights working side by side, developing investment strategies, analyzing merger and acquisition proposals, building a solid reputation in the financial world. Eleanor possessed a unique ability to identify hidden risks in complex contracts, an analytical capacity that saved the company from several potentially disastrous decisions over the years. Their shared dreams extended far beyond professional success. They planned an early retirement at 60, when they could finally dedicate themselves to traveling the world, free from the constant pressures of markets and clients. They had made detailed lists of countries they wanted to visit, cultures they longed to explore, experiences they had postponed year after year in favor of business opportunities that couldn't be missed. Eleanor was fluent in 3 languages, always, demonstrating a voracious intellectual curiosity about history, art, and philosophy. Julian often joked she was the only person he knew who could equally discuss financial derivatives and Italian Renaissance literature in the same conversation. The stroke happened on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday. Eleanor was reviewing quarterly reports when she suddenly experienced a severe headache, followed by loss of coordination on her left side and difficulty speaking. Julian immediately called an ambulance and the city's top neurologists, but the damage was already partially done by the time she reached the hospital. The doctors explained that while her cognitive functions remained essentially intact, she had suffered neurological damage resulting in partial paralysis on her left side and significant loss of overall mobility. This made the situation even more cruel in many ways than a complete cognitive loss would have been. Eleanor was mentally present and fully aware of all she had lost, but physically incapable of participating in life the way she always had. Julian reacted to the crisis in the only way he knew how, by throwing massive financial resources at the problem. He hired a team of the most respected neurologists in the Western Hemisphere, installed home rehabilitation equipment costing over $500,000, and completely transformed one of the estate's rooms into a private mini-clinic with everything modern medicine could offer: imported medications costing thousands of dollars a month, specialized physical therapists flown in from other countries specifically to work with Eleanor, neurologically specialized nurses on 24-hour call when needed. Julian was absolutely determined to use all his wealth and connections to provide the best treatment money could buy. However, the relentless demands of his firm hadn't lessened with the family crisis. If anything, they had intensified, because now Julian needed to generate even more resources to cover Isabella's extraordinarily expensive medical treatments. Urgent meetings that couldn't be postponed, business trips to close deals that would ensure the financial stability needed to maintain medical care, strategic decisions that would affect the future of the company and, consequently, the ability to continue paying for the best treatments available. Julian Thorne found himself perpetually torn between two seemingly incompatible needs: the professional responsibility that generated the financial resources essential to fund Eleanor's expensive treatment, and the personal desire to be physically and emotionally present to support her during her adaptation to this new reality. His attempts at presence were frequently interrupted by urgent calls, emails demanding immediate responses, or corporate crises that simply couldn't wait. He felt like he was constantly failing in both areas, unable to give the firm the undivided attention it demanded, and unable to give his wife the emotional support she so clearly needed. It was within this context of constant tension and divided priorities that Maria Elena Rodriguez entered the Thorne family's lives. At 38, she was a single mother of 2 teenage children and had worked as a domestic cleaner and caregiver for over 15 years, developing a solid reputation among high-income families who valued not only technical competence, but also absolute discretion and unquestionable reliability. Maria Elena's personal history was marked by challenges that most people in the Thorne social class only knew through statistics or newspaper reports. She had lost her husband John in a workplace accident on a construction site when her children were only 8 and 10 years old. John had fallen from scaffolding during the construction of a commercial building, and the company had offered a ridiculously small settlement that barely covered the funeral costs. Since then, Maria Elena had supported her family by working multiple jobs simultaneously: domestic cleaning in the mornings, elderly care in the afternoons, and occasionally catering jobs on weekends when she could arrange them. She had developed a particular specialization in caring for high-end residences, learning not only advanced cleaning and organizational techniques, but also developing an intuitive understanding of the specific and often unspoken needs of families living under pressures different from her own. The human resources agency that provided specialized domestic services to the city's financial elite had recommended Maria Elena to the Thornes with exceptional praise. All the previous families she had worked for provided references that highlighted not only her impeccable technical competence, but more subtle and valuable qualities: an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs before they were expressed, absolute discretion about private family matters, and a presence that somehow inexplicably made homes more welcoming and harmonious. During the initial interview, which lasted over 2 hours, Julian was genuinely impressed by Maria Elena's professional demeanor and emotional maturity. She answered questions directly and honestly, without trying to exaggerate her qualifications or make promises she couldn't keep. There was something in her eyes that conveyed a deep understanding of genuine responsibility and a commitment to authentic care that transcended a simple employer-employee relationship. When Julian explained Isabella's specific situation and the family's particular needs, Maria Elena listened with a concentrated attention that demonstrated she truly understood the emotional and practical complexities of the situation. She asked pertinent questions about Isabella's physical limitations, established medical routines, and personal preferences that could affect how she would organize her work in the house. Julian decided to hire her initially for general cleaning and household organization services, 3 times a week. The house was significantly too large for Eleanor to manage any kind of maintenance, and he didn't want to add household worries to the already considerable emotional and physical pressures she faced daily as part of her adaptation to the limitations imposed by the stroke. Maria Elena began her work at the Thorne estate with a methodical approach that quickly impressed everyone involved. She not only cleaned with remarkable efficiency, but reorganized spaces in a more functional way, paying special attention to Eleanor's specific needs for limited mobility. Small adjustments in the arrangement of furniture that facilitated navigation with assistive equipment, reorganization of closets to make essential items more accessible, careful selection of cleaning products that didn't leave strong odors that could cause discomfort or nausea. More significantly, Maria Elena demonstrated a natural sensitivity to Eleanor's unspoken emotional needs. She paid attention to subtle details. How Eleanor sighed when she thought no one was watching, the way her eyes fixed on the window for long periods, as if observing a life she could no longer fully live. The stack of books that remained untouched on the nightstand as a constant reminder of activities that had become more difficult to enjoy. What Julian didn't know, and which would prove crucial to the development of the relationship between Maria Elena and Eleanor, was that Maria Elena carried a deeply relevant and painful personal experience to the Thorne family's situation. She had cared for her own mother, Donna Carmen, for 5 long and challenging years before she passed away from complications related to severe rheumatoid arthritis. Donna Carmen had been an independent and proud woman who worked as a self-employed seamstress throughout her adult life, supporting Maria Elena and her 2 siblings after being abandoned by her husband when the children were still young. When the arthritis began to affect her hands and general mobility, she had to stop working and become progressively dependent on family care. During those 5 years caring for her mother, Maria Elena had learned not only essential practical techniques such as safe transfers from chair to bed, proper positioning to prevent bed sores and discomfort, preparation of nutritious meals adapted for swallowing limitations, and correct administration of complex medications. More importantly, she had developed a deep and empathetic understanding of the specific emotional needs of people struggling to maintain their personal dignity and sense of purpose while dealing with progressive physical limitations. Eleanor had learned that the emotional pain of losing independence and physical abilities was often more devastating than the direct physical discomfort. She'd observed how small gestures of respect and acknowledgement of the whole person, rather than an exclusive focus on limitations, could make huge differences in mood, motivation, and overall quality of life. Maria Elena had also developed practical skills in basic physiotherapy, simple therapeutic massage techniques, and most importantly, an almost intuitive ability to recognize nonverbal signs of discomfort, frustration, or specific needs that weren't being verbally expressed. Naturally, without making a fuss or asking for specific permission from Julian, Maria Elena began incorporating small gestures of care and special attention that went substantially beyond her officially defined responsibilities as a housekeeper. She observed Eleanor's emotional state with careful attention and responded in subtle but significant ways. When she sensed that Eleanor was particularly discouraged or melancholic, she'd prepare special teas using herbs she'd learned had calming properties, always asking about personal preferences and completely respecting any refusal or suggestion for modification. She completely reorganized the medication system, creating a discrete methodology that made daily administration less obvious and embarrassing, transforming constant reminders of the medical condition into elements more integrated into the natural routine. More significantly, Maria Elena began initiating genuine conversations with Eleanor on diverse and interesting topics during her cleaning and organizing activities. These weren't forced, artificial, or condescending conversations of the kind that often characterize interactions between employers and domestic workers, but authentic dialogues between two intelligent women about subjects that truly mattered to both of them. They talked about books they had read, movies they had watched and their impressions of them, memories of interesting trips, opinions on current political events, reflections on social changes they had observed throughout their lives. Maria Elena treated Eleanor exactly as what she was, an educated, experienced and insightful woman who happened to have physical limitations, not a diminished or incapable person who needed to be treated with condescension or pity. Eleanor, who initially had maintained a reserved and formally polite demeanor with the new employee following established social patterns between upper-class employers and domestic workers, gradually began to open up to Maria Elena in ways she hadn't anticipated. She discovered that Maria Elena, despite not having had access to advanced formal educational opportunities due to the economic circumstances of her life, possessed a practical wisdom, a life perspective, and an understanding of human nature that were genuinely fascinating and enriching. Maria Elena had read extensively throughout her life, educating herself through public libraries and used books, developing well-founded opinions on a surprisingly wide range of topics. They discovered unexpected shared interests, including a mutual appreciation for classical music, literature, and especially a curiosity about human psychology and the motivations that drive behavior in different situations. Eleanor was particularly impressed by Maria Elena's ability to analyze complex situations and identify underlying motivations with an accuracy that rivaled her own experience in business analysis. Julian observed these interactions during the limited periods when he was present at the estate, which unfortunately weren't very frequent due to the constant demands of his professional schedule. He felt a complex and sometimes contradictory mixture of emotions when witnessing the development of this unlikely but seemingly genuine friendship between his wife and the housekeeper. On the one hand, he felt genuine and profound gratitude because he could clearly see that Eleanor was more animated, more engaged with life, and more receptive to conversations than she had been at any time since the stroke. She showed signs of interest in external affairs, asked questions about current events, and even occasionally laughed spontaneously during conversations with Maria Elena. On the other hand, Julian also experienced persistent and uncomfortable guilt. He realized that Maria Elena was providing Eleanor with exactly the kind of emotional companionship, personal attention, and genuine human presence that he, as a devoted husband and life partner of almost 3 decades, should have been consistently offering. His own attempts to talk with Eleanor frequently turned, despite his best intentions, into updates on medical progress, technical discussions about new treatments he had researched, or detailed reports on small physical improvements he had noticed. He approached Eleanor as if she were a complex project that needed to be managed and optimized, instead of a person who simply needed to be seen, heard, and loved exactly as she was in the present moment. Julian didn't know how to simply be present with Eleanor without actively trying to solve some problem or implement some improvement in her condition. Maria Elena, by contrast, seemed to possess a natural ability to offer genuine presence and authentic attention without a specific agenda beyond recognizing and celebrating Eleanor's complete humanity. The domestic routine of the Thorne estate gradually settled into a pattern that worked well for everyone involved, although Julian didn't fully understand the depth of the transformations that were occurring during his absences. Maria Elena arrived punctually at 8 in the morning, always bringing a positive but respectful energy that started the day pleasantly for the whole house. She dedicated the first 2 hours to the cleaning and organizing activities themselves, working with a silent efficiency that allowed Eleanor to rest or engage in physiotherapy as needed. During this period, Maria Elena frequently played soft classical music discreetly, creating a more pleasant and less institutional atmosphere in the house. After completing her cleaning duties, Amelia prepared a nutritious and flavorful breakfast. Always considering Eleanor's specific dietary needs as established by her medical nutritionists, but finding creative ways to make the meals more interesting and appetizing than the strictly functional versions that characterized most medically supervised diets. The final 2 hours of each workday had become progressively the most meaningful and anticipated period for both women. This time was dedicated to more direct and personal interactions, sometimes involving conversations on topics of mutual interest, other times including collaborative activities like simple crafts that Eleanor could manage despite her motor limitations, or simply periods of silent but comfortable companionship while listening to music, or Amelia performed minor organizational tasks. Julian rarely witnessed these intimate moments of connection, because his rigorously structured professional routine took him to the corporate office very early in the morning, often before Amelia even arrived, and he typically returned home only in the late afternoon or early evening, after her work was finished and she had left to tend to her own family responsibilities. He had installed a comprehensive security camera system throughout the estate, primarily as an asset protection measure, considering the value of the property and artwork the house contained. But he had never paid specific attention to what happened during his extended absences. The system was configured to alert him only about intrusions or emergency situations, not for monitoring routine activities. A seemingly insignificant event during a family dinner would create the first indication that important transformations were happening in Eleanor's emotional life. During a casual conversation about how she had spent her day, Eleanor made a comment that would echo in Julian's mind for subsequent weeks. She mentioned, with a naturalness that initially disguised the emotional depth of the observation, that she was feeling an intense longing to dance. She explained how dance had been an absolutely fundamental part of her personal identity and emotional expression before the stroke, a form of physical and spiritual communication that she now felt was completely lost and inaccessible. Eleanor elaborated on how dance had not been merely a recreational activity for her, but an almost spiritual necessity. A way to process complex emotions, celebrate joys, and express aspects of her personality that she couldn't articulate through words. She described the feeling of fluid movement, the connection between music and bodily expression, the freedom to communicate through gestures and rhythm in ways that transcended verbal limitations. Julian attempted to respond in a consoling and constructive way, but his words inevitably became technical and oriented toward future solutions. He spoke of temporary medical limitations that could improve with time and continued treatment, mentioned possibilities of new experimental treatments he was researching, and described even more advanced rehabilitation equipment that could be acquired if they showed potential to restore greater mobility. He discussed optimistic recovery timelines, statistics about patients with similar injuries who had regained motor skills, and strategies to maximize the effectiveness of current treatments. His intentions were genuinely loving and hopeful, but the effect of his words was inadvertently to minimize the present loss Eleanor was expressing, focusing on future possibilities instead of acknowledging and validating the emotional pain she was experiencing in the present moment. Eleanor simply agreed politely with his optimistic comments and changed the subject. But Julian noticed something in her expression and body language that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't just sadness or frustration, emotions he had learned to recognize, and that made sense given the circumstances. It was something more troubling, a kind of quiet resignation, as if she were gradually giving up on essential aspects of who she was as a person. This observation reverberated in Julian's mind for several days after the conversation. He began to question whether his approach based on technical solutions and forced optimism might be inadvertently contributing to Eleanor's emotional isolation instead of providing the support she truly needed. Amelia, who by coincidence was organizing the kitchen adjacent to the dining room during part of that conversation, overheard Eleanor's comments about longing to dance and thought deeply about those words for several subsequent days. The observation awakened memories of her own mother expressing similar feelings about activities that had defined her identity before progressively debilitating physical limitations set in and restricted her possibilities for personal expression. Amelia specifically remembered how Donna Carmen had spoken about missing sewing, not just as an economic activity, but as a form of artistic and creative expression that provided deep satisfaction and a sense of purpose. When arthritis made it impossible to manipulate needles and delicate fabrics, Donna Carmen had experienced a loss that transcended practical inconveniences, representing a disconnection from fundamental aspects of her personal identity. Discreetly, without mentioning her plans or research to anyone, Amelia began investigating information about adapted movement therapies, therapeutic dance, and physical expression programs specifically developed for people with diverse motor limitations. She used computers at the local public library during her free hours, researching on medical websites, universities, and organizations specializing in holistic rehabilitation. What she discovered was surprising and hopeful. Not only was adapted dance possible for people with limitations similar to Eleanor's, but it was frequently recommended by specialized physical therapists and psychologists as a particularly effective form of rehabilitation that simultaneously works on physical, emotional, and cognitive aspects of recovery. Amelia found academic studies demonstrating that therapeutic dance could improve coordination, balance, muscle strength, and especially self-esteem and emotional quality of life for patients in situations similar to Eleanor's. There were videos of people with motor limitations participating in adaptive dance programs and clearly experiencing joy, expression, and a sense of accomplishment through these activities. More importantly, Eleanor understood that adaptive dance wasn't about trying to replicate traditional movements or recover lost abilities, but about finding new ways of physical expression that celebrated and utilized the currently available capabilities, creating possibilities of movement that were meaningful and satisfying within existing limitations. During the following week, Eleanor made a decision that would prove to be transformative for the entire Thorne family. She decided to carefully approach the subject with Julian, offering the possibility of experimenting together with some very basic forms of therapeutic movement. To the sound of music that Julian considered appropriate and pleasant. Eleanor brought a small, discreet, portable speaker, and with extreme sensitivity and care, suggested to Julian that perhaps they could try some very gentle and simple movements to the sound of classical music that Julian enjoyed. She repeatedly emphasized that it would be something completely experimental, without pressure or expectations, and that it could be stopped immediately if Julian felt uncomfortable for any reason. Julian's initial reaction was one of resistance and even alarm. He detailed his physical limitations, the constant and rational fear of injuring himself or suffering a fall that could cause additional damage, and especially the deep emotional fear of directly confronting everything he had lost in terms of physical expressive capacity. "Eleanor," he said, with a trembling voice and eyes full of tears, "I'm not the person who danced anymore. It would be cruel to myself to pretend I can still do something that used to bring me so much joy. It would be like opening a wound that I'm trying to let heal." Eleanor completely understood Julian's resistance and didn't try to persuade him or minimize his legitimate concerns. Instead, she sat comfortably beside Julian's chair and for the first time since she had started working for the family, shared intimate details about her own experience caring for her mother, Donna Carmen, during the difficult years of progressive physical decline. She talked about how she had initially made the mistake of trying to encourage her mother to continue trying to sew in the traditional way, even when it became obviously impossible, and how this approach had only increased the frustration and sense of loss that Donna Carmen experienced. Eleanor described how eventually she had learned that the solution wasn't in trying to recreate activities exactly as they were before, but in finding new forms of expression that utilized existing capabilities instead of lamenting lost ones. "It's not about pretending to be who you were," she said with genuine kindness, "but about discovering who you can be now, at this moment, with the capabilities you have today. My mother never went back to sewing complete garments, but she discovered she could do small embroideries and decorations that brought joy in a completely new way." The conversation stretched for over 2 hours, during which Eleanor shared philosophies about adaptation, resilience, and especially about the crucial difference between accepting limitations realistically and surrendering completely to them. She talked about how she had observed that small movements connected to music had improved not only her mother's mood, but also her overall coordination, her self-esteem, and especially her sense of purpose and connection with aspects of her identity that remained intact and vital. Eleanor didn't minimize or dismiss the genuine losses that Julian had experienced, but offered an alternative perspective on possibilities that still existed and could be explored in new and potentially rewarding ways. She emphasized that any experiment would be completely controlled by Julian, proceeding only at his pace and according to his comfort, without any external agenda or expectations about specific results. Finally, after much dialogue and careful consideration, Julian hesitantly agreed to try a very basic and experimental session, establishing clear and non-negotiable conditions, minimal and extremely careful movements, music at a low volume to not disturb anyone else in the house, and the absolute promise to stop immediately if he felt physically uncomfortable, emotionally overwhelmed, or simply didn't want to continue. Eleanor enthusiastically agreed to all the conditions and added her own assurances. Everything would be done exclusively at Julian's pace, without any pressure to achieve specific movements or progress, and with complete focus on what felt good and natural instead of trying to replicate any traditional form of dance. For the first experimental session, they decided to keep everything extremely simple and low-key. Julian would remain seated in his specialized chair, which offered optimal support and eliminated any risk of falls or injury. Eleanor selected a gentle piece by Chopin that she knew Julian appreciated, adjusted to a volume that was audible but not intrusive. Initially, they simply sat together and listened to the music, allowing it to fill the space between them and create an atmosphere of calm and openness. This period of just listening proved to be unexpectedly moving for both, as it had been months since Julian had intentionally focused on music purely for enjoyment instead of as background noise during medical routines. After several minutes of just absorbing the music, Eleanor gently suggested that perhaps they could try some almost imperceptible movements, very gentle rotations of the wrists, small head movements that accompanied the rhythm, tiny gestures with fingers that followed the melody. Nothing that could be considered dancing in any traditional sense, but small expressions of response to the music that might feel natural and comfortable. Julian was obviously tense and hyper-conscious of every limitation at the beginning, but gradually something began to shift. The music seemed to awaken deep muscle memories and emotional connections that had been dormant for years, and his body, even with its current limitations, began to respond in ways that were subtle but genuinely expressive. Eleanor, observing carefully Julian's reactions and reading his nonverbal cues with practiced sensitivity, gradually began to guide him in slightly more elaborate movements that remained completely within safe parameters. Gentle lifts of the arms, respecting the limitations of her range of motion, small rotations of the torso, staying within comfortable boundaries, movements of the fingers and hands that traced melodic lines in ways that felt both musical and physically satisfying. What most impressed Eleanor was that Maria Elena never attempted to direct or teach in any traditional sense. Instead, she followed Eleanor's natural impulses, amplifying movements that arose spontaneously and offering gentle support when needed, but always allowing Eleanor to lead and determine what felt right for her body and emotional state in each moment. It was a collaborative form of movement expression that respected both capacities and limitations, creating space for authentic expression within realistic parameters. This wasn't about trying to recover lost abilities, but about discovering new forms of physical and emotional expression that were possible and meaningful within her current reality. After this first session of approximately 20 minutes, Eleanor admitted that she was feeling more connected with her own body than she had felt in literally years. It wasn't about recovering what she had lost, but about discovering new possibilities for expression that she hadn't known existed within her present circumstances. "I feel like I remembered something important about myself that I thought was gone forever," she told Maria Elena with tears in her eyes. "Not exactly what I used to be, but something new that honors who I am now." The adapted dance sessions became a regular part of the weekly routine between Eleanor and Maria Elena. Eleanor began to request specific songs, pieces that awakened positive memories or that simply made her feel more alive and connected. Maria Elena researched different musical styles that might work better for different types of movement, always consulting with Eleanor about her preferences and comfort level. The progress was subtle but consistent. Eleanor developed greater body awareness, improved coordination in the movements she could perform, better emotional regulation, and most importantly, a renewed sense of joy and purpose that had been missing since the stroke. She began to look forward eagerly to the days when Maria Elena came to work, not just for the companionship, but for the opportunity to express herself through movement in ways that felt authentic and satisfying. During this period of gradual transformation, Julian remained completely unaware of the developments that were occurring in his own house during his prolonged absences. He continued to be absorbed in complex negotiations for a multi-billion-dollar merger that had been consuming most of his attention for months, requiring extensive travel, late-night conference calls with international investors, and constant analysis of market conditions that affected the viability of the proposed transaction. When he was home, he was typically involved in telephone calls or review of documents, assuming that Eleanor was being adequately cared for by the medical professionals and by Maria Elena in her capacity as a domestic worker. He noticed that Eleanor seemed more animated lately, more willing to engage in conversations during meals, more interested in current events that she had ignored for months, more responsive to his attempts at communication. Julian attributed this improvement primarily to the adjustments in medication that the neurologist had made recently, or perhaps to the natural progress of the recovery process. It never occurred to him that significant emotional and physical healing might be occurring through completely different mechanisms than the expensive medical treatments he was funding. During this same period, Maria Elena was also experiencing her own transformation. Caring for Eleanor was awakening aspects of her personality that had been dormant since her mother's death. She felt useful again in a way that transcended merely earning money to support her children. There was a deeper purpose in her work that energized and inspired her in ways she hadn't experienced in years. The conversations between Maria Elena and Eleanor also evolved to include more intimate and meaningful topics. They talked about motherhood, about the challenges of maintaining relationships during difficult periods, about dreams that had been modified but not necessarily abandoned, about finding meaning and purpose within changed circumstances. A genuine friendship was developing, based on mutual respect and shared understanding about resilience and adaptation. Eleanor began asking questions about Maria Elena's life, her children, her financial struggles, her own aspirations beyond survival and basic provision for her family. She discovered that Maria Elena had always dreamed of opening a small care center for elderly people, using skills she had developed caring for her mother and expertise she had gained, working with diverse families over years. It was a dream that seemed completely impossible given her limited financial resources, but that she maintained alive in her heart as something that might someday be achievable if circumstances ever permitted. Eleanor found herself genuinely moved by the nobility of this aspiration and began thinking about her own life and about how her perspective had changed since the stroke. These deeper conversations made Eleanor reflect on what she still might contribute or experience, instead of focusing exclusively on what she had lost. Maria Elena's presence was gradually reintroducing possibilities into her life that she had assumed were permanently foreclosed by her physical limitations. The adapted dance sessions became progressively more elaborate and emotionally expressive. Maria Elena brought different types of music, classical, smooth jazz, even some pieces of Brazilian music that sparked curiosity in Eleanor about cultures she never had explored deeply. They developed a non-verbal language of communication during these sessions, a form of emotional intimacy that neither had experienced in a long time. One day, Eleanor surprised Maria Elena by saying that she had been thinking about songs she would like to experiment with during their sessions. She had made a mental list of pieces that awakened specific memories of her life with Julian, from the early years of their marriage, when they actually danced together at parties and social events. "Would it be too strange," Eleanor asked hesitantly, "if I wanted to try movement with music that I used to dance with Julian? Not to try to recreate what was before, but maybe to reinterpret these memories in a new form that honors both what was and what is now." Maria Elena understood immediately the emotional depth of what Eleanor was proposing. It wasn't about nostalgia or an attempt to recover the past, but about reintegrating important aspects of her personal history into her current reality, finding new ways to connect with meaningful memories within her present capabilities. "Of course it wouldn't be strange," Eleanor responded. "Your memories are part of who you are. Finding new ways to connect with them can be very healing and meaningful." The next session was particularly intense emotionally. Eleanor had chosen a waltz that she and Julian had danced at their wedding, a song she hadn't listened to since before the stroke, because it had been too painful, awakening memories of mobility and partnership that seemed forever lost, with Maria Elena beside her, offering physical and emotional support. Eleanor explored movements that evoked the essence of the original dance without attempting to replicate it exactly. It was about connecting with emotional memory through adapted physical expression, honoring both what had been and what was possible now. Tears flowed down Eleanor's face during this session, but they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of reconnection, of rediscovery of aspects of herself that she had given up as lost forever. Maria Elena was also visibly moved, understanding that she was witnessing a moment of profound healing that transcended physical rehabilitation. After this particular session, Eleanor expressed a gratitude that Maria Elena had never experienced in any work she had done. "You gave back to me a part of myself that I thought had died," she said, "not the same way as it was before, but in a new form that is precious in its own right." It was in this context of emotional transformation and deepening connection that a national holiday approached, which would create the opportunity for Julian to finally discover what was happening in his own house during his prolonged absences. Thanksgiving arrived at a particularly intense moment for Julian. A corporate merger that had consumed months of his life was entering the final phase of negotiations, and he had planned to use the day off to review crucial contracts and prepare presentations for decisive meetings that would happen the following week. Julian decided to work in his home office, taking advantage of the quiet of the holiday to concentrate. Without the constant interruptions that characterized his normal days at the corporate office, he had spread documents across his entire desk, opened multiple computer screens, and prepared for a marathon of financial analysis and strategic planning. Maria Elena had arranged to come to work even though it was a holiday. Eleanor was feeling particularly well, ultimately, and they had planned a special session of adapted dance, using songs that Eleanor had selected carefully. During the week, it was to be a celebration of all the progress they had achieved together. During the morning, Julian was completely absorbed in financial spreadsheets and market projections when he realized that he had forgotten some essential documents in his bedroom. They were original contracts that he needed to compare with digital versions, and their absence was preventing him from continuing his analysis. He went upstairs quietly, thinking to get the documents. Quickly, without disrupting what he imagined to be a routine moment of rest or physical therapy for Eleanor. Julian had developed a habit of moving discreetly through the house to avoid creating unnecessary disturbances in his wife's care routine. As he approached the corridor leading to the master bedroom, he noticed something unusual. There was music playing, not just background sound from the television or radio that Eleanor sometimes used for companionship, but classical music deliberately selected, playing at a volume that suggested intentional activity. What really caught his attention, however, was the sound of laughter, not polite or forced laughter, but genuine bursts of pure joy, a sound that he hadn't heard from Eleanor in literally years. It was laughter that bubbled up from a place of authentic happiness, the kind of spontaneous expression that had disappeared completely from her life since the stroke. Curious and slightly concerned, Julian slowed his pace and approached the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. He could see through the crack, but remained outside the field of vision of whoever was inside. What he saw in that moment would change not only his understanding about his wife and Maria Elena, but about his own life and priorities. Eleanor was in her specialized chair, but her posture was completely different from anything Julian had observed in the last 3 years. Instead of the tense rigidity that normally characterized her movements, she was relaxed, fluid, with an expression of genuine joy illuminating her face. Her arms were moving gracefully to the rhythm of the music, her shoulders were swaying gently, and her head was tracking the melody with natural and expressive movements. Maria Elena was beside her, not directing or teaching, but participating in a form of collaborative dance that completely respected Eleanor's physical limitations while celebrating her remaining capacities. They had created a language of movement that was unique, adapted, and profoundly connected to the music that was playing. But what most shocked Julian weren't the movements themselves, but the expression on Eleanor's face. She was genuinely happy, not just content or resigned, but radiant, with a joy that Julian had assumed was lost forever. There was a light in her eyes that he hadn't seen since before the stroke, a vitality that all the expensive treatments and sophisticated equipment hadn't been able to restore. Maria Elena, in turn, demonstrated a dedication and care that went far beyond any job description. She anticipated Eleanor's movement needs, offered support exactly when necessary, and participated in the dance with her own joy that was clearly authentic. There was no condescension or pity in her interaction, but a collaboration between equals, exploring possibilities of expression. Julian stood watching for several minutes, unable to move or make any sound. He was witnessing a version of his wife that he had forgotten existed, not the version before the stroke, but a new version that had emerged through care, understanding, and acceptance of her current circumstances. The music that was playing was a waltz by Chopin that he recognized. It was a piece that Eleanor had always loved, but that she had stopped listening to after the stroke because it awakened painful memories of her lost mobility. Now, she was reinterpreting it, finding new ways to connect with music that respected her current limitations. At a specific moment in the music, Eleanor extended her right hand toward the space where a dance partner would be, and Maria Elena gently touched her hand, creating a connection that allowed Eleanor to express the movement that her muscle memory still carried. It was a moment of pure beauty, a celebration of life and possibility amidst real limitations. It was in that exact moment that Julian felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A tear escaped from his eyes, followed by others, as he comprehended what he was truly witnessing. It wasn't just his wife dancing, but his wife rediscovered, alive in a form he had assumed was impossible. The emotion that took hold of him was complex and overwhelming. Gratitude for Maria Elena seeing possibilities where he had seen only limitations, guilt for having been so absent that he had completely missed this transformation, regret for having focused so intensively on medical solutions and technological approaches that he had neglected fundamental emotional needs. But above all, Julian felt a rediscovery of love for Eleanor that had been buried under layers of medical concern, financial responsibility, and attempts to solve problems that perhaps didn't need to be solved, but rather reinterpreted. When the music ended, he saw Eleanor and Maria Elena embrace with genuine affection that transcended any employment relationship. It was a real friendship, based on mutual respect and authentic care. Maria Elena was offering something that no expensive equipment could provide: genuine human presence and profound understanding. Julian realized that he had witnessed not just an intimate moment, but a silent revolution in his own home. While he was building financial empires, Maria Elena was helping to rebuild his wife's soul. While he was providing world-class medical care, Maria Elena was offering equally essential human care. A tear that had escaped transformed into silent weeping, but not of sadness. It was weeping of recognition, of awakening, of understanding about what truly mattered. Julian was seeing his wife not as a patient who needed to be cured, but as a person who needed to be seen, understood, and celebrated for who she was in the present moment. Julian remained in the doorway for a few more moments, processing the depth of what he had witnessed. When Eleanor and Maria Elena began to discuss a session they had just completed, he realized that he needed to make a decision about how to proceed. He could simply get his documents and return to work, pretending that nothing had happened. Or he could enter the room and acknowledge that he had witnessed something extraordinary. The choice he made in that moment would define not only the rest of that day, but the future of his family. Julian knocked gently on the door and entered the room. Both Eleanor and Maria Elena were initially surprised and slightly embarrassed, as if they had been caught doing something inappropriate. Eleanor began to apologize, explaining that they were just experimenting with some therapeutic movements. "No," Julian said, his voice choked with emotion. "Don't apologize. I saw you dancing, and it was the most beautiful thing I've witnessed in years." The silence that followed was loaded with emotion. Eleanor looked at Julian with an expression of vulnerability that he hadn't seen since the first days after the stroke. Maria Elena became visibly uncomfortable, uncertain about how to interpret her employer's reaction. Julian approached Eleanor's chair and, for the first time in months, truly looked at her. Not as a doctor evaluating progress or a worried husband checking symptoms, but as a man seeing the woman he loved. "You are radiant," he said simply. "I had forgotten how beautiful you look when you're happy." Eleanor began to cry, but they were tears of relief. "Julian," she said, "I felt so lost. Maria Elena helped me to find parts of myself that I thought had died. Not the same parts as before, but new parts that are precious." Julian turned to Maria Elena, who was clearly moved, but trying to maintain professional composure. "Maria Elena," he said, "I don't have words to express my gratitude. You gave my wife something that I didn't know how to give, a possibility to be happy exactly as she is now." Maria Elena finally spoke, with a trembling voice. "Mr. Thorne, I only did what anyone would do. Your wife is a wonderful woman who deserves joy. I just tried to help her find ways to express it." "No," Julian responded firmly, "you did much more than that. You saw possibilities where I only saw problems. You offered presence where I offered solutions. You treated my wife as a complete person while I treated her as a recovery project." The conversation that followed lasted more than 2 hours. Julian cancelled all his work activities for the day and sat on the floor of the room, something he hadn't done in years, to talk with his wife and Maria Elena about what he had learned observing them. Eleanor explained how the adapted dance sessions had become much more than physical exercises. They were moments of reconnection with her own humanity, opportunities to express emotions that she had kept repressed, and celebrations of capacities she still possessed instead of lamentations over lost abilities. Maria Elena shared her philosophy about care, developed through her experience with her own mother. She explained that she had learned that people with physical limitations frequently didn't need to be cured to be happy, but rather understood and supported in finding new ways to live fully. Julian admitted that he had been so focused on trying to restore a previous version of Eleanor that he had completely missed the opportunity to know and love the current version. He recognized that his absence wasn't just physical, but emotional, and that he had delegated the most human aspects of caring for his wife because he didn't know how to deal with them. "I thought that providing the best medical treatment and the best resources was the way to demonstrate love," he said. "But I realized that you needed me simply to be present, to see you as you are now, not as a broken version of who you were before." From that day forward, the dynamic of the Thorne family changed completely. Julian reorganized his work schedule to be present during at least one of Eleanor's adapted dance sessions per week. Initially, he just observed, learning about his wife's needs and capabilities from a completely new perspective. Eventually, Maria Elena suggested that Julian participate in the sessions. With her careful guidance, he learned ways to interact physically with Eleanor that respected her limitations while celebrating her capacities. It wasn't like dancing had been in the past, but it was something new and special that they could share in the present. Julian also made a significant decision about Maria Elena's role in the family. He recognized that she had become much more than a domestic worker. She was a specialized caregiver, an intuitive therapist, and a true friend to Eleanor. He offered to substantially increase her salary and officially redefine her role as caregiver companion. More importantly, when he learned about Maria Elena's dream of opening a care center for elderly people, Julian offered financial and business support to make that dream a reality, not as charity, but as an investment in someone who had demonstrated extraordinary understanding about authentic human care. The care center that Maria Elena eventually opened became a model of holistic care, combining medical needs with emotional and spiritual needs. Julian became an investor and consultant, learning so much about human leadership through Maria Elena's approach. Eleanor became an unofficial ambassador for adapted dance programs for people with motor limitations. Her own journey of rediscovery inspired other people in similar situations to explore possibilities of expression and joy that they had assumed were lost. In the months that followed, the Thorne estate transformed into a place of genuine life instead of a luxurious clinic. Music became a constant presence. Friends and family were invited for more frequent visits, and conversations became about life and possibilities instead of just doctors and limitations. Julian learned that true wealth wasn't just in the financial resources he possessed, but in the capacity to create authentic human connections and be genuinely present for the people he loved. He continued being successful in business, but developed a very different perspective about what constitutes a rich and meaningful life. Maria Elena became a bridge between different socio-economic worlds, demonstrating that wisdom, compassion, and care skills transcend formal education or financial status. Her influence on the Thorne family showed how people of diverse backgrounds can contribute mutually to the growth and well-being of each other. The Thorne family's story became a powerful demonstration of how physical limitations don't need to mean limitations of joy, and of how authentic human presence is frequently more valuable than material resources. Most importantly, it showed how recognizing and valuing contributions from people of all social backgrounds can enrich lives in ways that money alone never could. Years later, when Julian reflected on the moment when he saw Maria Elena and Eleanor dancing for the first time, he recognized that the tear that had escaped didn't just mark a moment of emotion, but the beginning of his own transformation from a successful man into a man truly rich in meaningful human relationships. The adapted dance continued being a central part of Eleanor's life. but it expanded to include the entire family. They discovered that movement, music, and human connection were powerful medicines that couldn't be bought, only cultivated through presence, patience, and genuine love.